Hi, my name's Dave. Welcome to my shop.
Yeah, I could be the mayor down there and say, but sorry,
We're going to do a slide overview of the 1949 Chevrolet 3100 half-ton pickup truck. This truck is fairly stock. It's real close to the condition it was in when it was new, with some slight modifications. Some of them just to make it safer, other mods just to make it run a little better. The wheels are the stock 6-bolt wheels. They're 16-inch. The tires are actually 225 75R 16s. And they're really a little too wide for the rims, but they're holding air and they seem to ride pretty good. When I go to get new tires on it, I'm going to get skinnier tires, possibly a 205 maybe. Or I may try to get those old classic tires, 650 16s. We'll just see. But I'm definitely going to go with radials. This truck came with a, this particular truck came with a 216 cubic inch power plant. It's an overhead valve, inline 6-cylinder, and it produced a rated 90 horsepower. It's really close to stock condition. I do have some mods that are real obvious jumping out, so I'll try to explain them as we go. The first mod, I guess you see, is that this tube right here, and what that is, that's just a hillbilly engineered radiator overflow reservoir. The engine itself, with a 160-degree thermostat, rarely gets hot, but on hot days, if you totally fill that radiator to the very top, you'll soon discover that it's going to puke out about 1 inch to 2 inches of the coolant. Now it'll slowly, over time, when it gets hot, when I say hot, it's hot outside, puke a little more and a little more, and before you know it, you're having to add coolant. This engine, after I got it running, never overheated with the 160-degree thermostat, but I didn't like the idea of my coolant leaking, so I added this reservoir. And that radiator cap is a zero pressure radiator cap. In other words, if the pressure builds up to over 0, let's say it gets to 1 psi, it's going to open, and that's when it allows the coolant to seep out. So instead of dumping it on the ground, I shoot it over to this reservoir, and with the 160-degree thermostat, I may get 1 inch or so of coolant in there. Back when I tried a 180 in the winter time, mainly to combat condensation in the valve cover. Ends up that that didn't rectify it, and that would actually cause my coolant to go up to almost 3.5 inches. So I've got this red line right here, and so it would actually run hotter. It would run hotter by the gauge also with that 180. So I went back, since it didn't rectify my condensation in the valve cover, only in cold winter weather, I went back to the 160. I don't get hot, and what coolant does make its way to that reservoir is once the engine cools off, it'll actually suck it back into the reservoir, the main radiator reservoir, keeping it full. So I've done that mod probably about 6,000 miles ago, and I haven't had to add any coolant since. And yep, it's still topped off, so that's a good mod that you may think about doing. Let's see, I mentioned about the condensation. I added this vented oil filler cap, and in order to try to, and I had blow by so bad because the bottom end of this engine is quite old. It's got over 100,000 miles on the bottom end. I pulled the head and had it rebuilt, so the head's got maybe 14,000 miles on it since rebuilt. But I've got tremendous blow by, but it's actually improved as the more I drive it. Before, out of these 3 vents, I would have steam and smoke just billowing out, and I could smell it in the cab even. It was pretty bad. And in cold weather, I'd have condensation collecting up right up here in the front, primarily from the cold air from this fan kicking back. So another mod I've done to try to combat that and to make it breathe better was to add a PCV valve down here to my draft tube. The stock draft tubes on these really don't start pulling air out of the engine until you're moving and you have air going across the opening in the bottom. Well, with that PCV valve, it's constantly, the manifold, the intake is actually pulling the fumes out at all times and actually burning it. That's kind of a modern modification. It's really good for the environment and good for the engine. So, but that didn't alleviate the blowback either. But I like that mod. It makes sense to help it breathe. So to have it breathe, I still have the caps, the 3 vents open. I've got that vent cap, and I've got the PCV valve. And my blow-by, as I said, has gotten better with usage. And I don't have as nearly what I had. I barely smell it in the cab now. Another mod is this air cleaner. That's an oil bath air cleaner. This is what came on it. This is a wire mesh. That's all that's in it. And it sat there on top of the carburetor. And basically all it would stop is boulders. It wouldn't stop. I mean, that mesh wouldn't stop anything fine. It wouldn't stop dust or dirt. This oil bath was offered on as an option on heavy-duty type trucks that operated in dusty, dirty conditions, and so I added it to this engine to try to get better filtering. Another mod that was done is this bypass oil filter. Now, it is what it says. It's a bypass oil filter. High pressure oil does not, let me put it this way. On modern vehicles, oil leaves the oil pump, and the first place it goes to is to a full pressure oil filter, and then it distributes to the engine. This is a bypass. The oil, in this case, leaves the oil pump. It hits a gallery that runs the entire length of the engine on this side, and then it, via drilled passages, it direct feeds oil, pressure oil, to the crankshaft 4 main bearings and the camshaft 4 main bearings, the camshaft's 4 bearings. So that oil is not filtered. It's just fed directly to those the crank and the cam bearings. The gallery down here, you can't see it because of the lighting, but there's a T tapped into it. Off that T is an oil line, which is this line right here. It goes down here, taps into that T, and it goes to the oil pressure gauge. So you can get a gauge of the oil pressure in the main oil gallery. The other tap off that T is this is the oil pressure line going to the top of the oil pressure bypass filter. And what it is to keep this from robbing all the pressure oil in the system. The oil dumps into this canister, this full, and then there's that filter. There's a drop-in filter element, and about a third of the way up is a precision drilled hole. I think it's maybe 3/16 perhaps, and that goes in. That is where the filtered oil, after it goes through the filter, it hits that hole and it drains back into the oil pan crankcase. Now that small hole is what keeps the pressure down in this and keeps the pressure up in the for the rest of the system. Works pretty good that way. If you actually had a T and you had the same oil pressure running through this as you did the rest of the engine, you'd be robbing pressure. So with that orifice in that drilled in that, which is a precision hole. It regulates and keeps the oil down. The PVC tube comes over here, and here's the manifold vacuum port, and here's a T I put in, and this other lead goes into the vacuum wipers. And yeah, they work. They don't work nowhere near as good as electrics. Anybody can tell you that if you're going to drive one of these things daily, you'll want to go to electric wipers. But for my use, where the only time I need them is when I'm caught out in the rain, well, they work good enough to get me home. Another main mod is often talked about on these, but the single carburetor, is manifold heat. If you notice, here's the manifold, the carburetor. Fuel's got to travel that runner all the way here to get to the 1 and 2 cylinders, 3 and 4, 5 and 6. So that fuel, once it's in those runners, can cool to the point where it will liquefy, and you don't want your fuel liquefied. You want it atomized. You want it to be more of a fog, because the fog will burn, atomized fuel will burn more efficiently in each cylinder. What the engineers has come up with, and this is a single exhaust system, is they use a flapper off the exhaust manifold, and when the engine's cold, and there's a spring down here, when the engine's cold, exhaust heat actually circulates around in a chamber directly underneath the carburetor. It's separate from the fuel air chamber. Okay, they're not mixed, but its purpose is to heat that chamber. So fuel and air that's coming down from the carburetor, hitting the bottom, and then going to each runner to the cylinder that's actually drawing it. That heat helps vaporize that fuel air. It keeps it atomized. Eventually, once the engine warms up and the heat's transferred to the cast iron manifolds, well, the heat, that actual operating heat, will be enough to do that. Excellently, and so that exhaust heat is no longer needed. So there's this spring actually starts coiling, unwinding, and it moves a flapper over here, and that flapper actually has a flapper valve inside the manifolds, and what it does, it blocks off the exhaust heat from coming up into that chamber and directs it straight out the exhaust, so that increases efficiency. Now, that's a pretty unique design. If the engineers didn't feel like you needed that heat, they wouldn't have went to that intricate design to do it. So, manifold heat, yes, you definitely want it on an inline 6 engine. The electrics, this is still 6 volt. There's your 6 volt generator down there. There's the 6 volt regulator. There's 2 leads. The field and armature leads that comes off between the regulator and the generator. Real easy to troubleshoot, and generally works good and lasts a long time. This is the fuse box, this one here on the right. That came stock on the engine. There's fuses in there for the headlights, parking light, tail light, and brake light. The standard glass type fuses from back in the day. I added this one and this device later. What this device is here is a 6 volt to 12 volt power inverter, and it'll provide up to 12 volts at up to 10 amps. That is to power some 12 volt accessories I am adding. I don't want to change my whole electric out to 12 volt yet, so I just wanted to add that. What I have in here is a couple relays and a couple fuses, and actually just a splice point to where I can have a separate block for my 12 volt system. Right now I'm just feeding a 12 volt tachometer and a lighter power outlet. If I were to add a radio, that 10 amp power supply would provide for that too, if I was still running 6 volt. But right now we want to remain 6 volts since it's working fine, And we'll worry about going to 12 volt when I go to put that engine in it over there, which actually has an alternator on it, 12 volt alternator. But that's not going to happen until this engine dies, and it's just running so good right now. It's I do not want it. I don't want to fix it if it's not broke. If that's the word. All right. For $49, it said 3100 underneath the Chevrolet. That's what the mirror, the only mirror that came stock on it. I've added that mirror. Here's the 12 volt tack. I've wired it, I've mounted it with a magnet now. I didn't want to drill any holes or otherwise mar up the dash, because this dash is in such good condition, in original condition. I just wanted to leave it that way. Everything seems to work. So there's your lights. And I added turn signals just for safety primarily, because I do drive this out in traffic. And it's an aftermarket deal, and I've wired it to where it'll work without being on the switches. In order to do it, this truck, well, before I get into that, I want to show that the seats are reupholstered and the side panels are different. And I did add the ceiling, new cardboard liner. I did add another tail light. This truck only came with a single tail light and brake light. Well, now I've got duals on it and functioning turn signals. I modified the parking lights with the equivalent of 1157, but it's a 6 volt, and the number escapes me at this point. So I can have parking lights, and I could also have turn signals. This still has the original Huck brakes. Huck is the predecessor to the Bendix style drum brakes, and works off a single reservoir master cylinder. The wheel cylinders are slightly bigger in the fronts by about maybe a 1/16 of an inch or a 32nd of an inch, and so presumably they'd get a little bit more pressure, giving them a little more stopping power in the front. But basically it's the same brakes. Huck brakes are the predecessor to Bendix. Some say they're not as good. They work okay for this stock setup. If you go to a modified engine with more horsepower, you'll need better stopping power. Straight axle in the front, kingpins, leaf springs. This is lever action shocks. Can't show a picture of it now the way I'm parked, instead of the new modern tube style. And the bed is some tongue and groove I had laying around. This is not the original type bed. I do have the trim to one day restore it. But the engine runs good. The truck runs good. I drive it every weekend, and it's a very enjoyable truck to drive. And if you need a reminder of the good old days, well, that's what you need. I would prefer to keep it as period correct as possible and enjoy it for what it is, as an old truck. I've got a new truck if I want to drive something new. I don't want to drive something new when I drive this. So thanks for watching. You can post some questions, I'll answer them. Otherwise, see ya.